So for this one, it's just how do you prove an argument? And we're going to walk through the latter three parts of an argument, namely analysis, impacts, weighing, to kind of understand how do you go about it. And I think proof for an argument is one of the more difficult things to master. It's going to be what your opponents will rebut the most a lot of the time, especially when you're starting out. And mastering proofs and how to go about them, I think, one of the most useful skills in debating. So, how do you prove an argument? I think you need four things. One is to prove capacity, meaning can the actors in question actually do what you need them to do? Second is incentive. Simply, do they want to do what you want them to do? Third is characterization. What is their nature? What are they like? And how does that impact the argument? Lastly is logical sequencing. How do you put it together? And speaking from a mathematical perspective, I think a lot of people assume that if you just say a bunch of true things, then an argument follows. When those true things have to imply the next thing, you can't just give a series of true statements. And so you have to sequence what you're arguing in a manner that makes sense, where everything follows from the previous thing. So first, for capacity, you want to prove can they do it? So for example, let's say the motion is this house would ban alcohol. Gov could make the argument that a ban on alcohol would significantly reduce crime, alcoholism, domestic abuse, etc. And this could be a really important argument, especially if it's true. Reducing crime, alcoholism, and domestic abuse seem like really, really important things, but they don't happen if you don't first prove that a ban could be meaningfully enforced. In fact, the prohibition showed that banning alcohol oftentimes leads to black markets, further proliferation, more dangerous alcohol, etc. And so, in this motion, you have to prove that your ban is going to be effective in order for you to get to where you want to be. And the way that happens is to prove you can do it, that it is possible for, say, a government to actually enforce an alcohol ban. And thus, you'd have to spend your argument explaining why that would be possible. Second is incentive. Do they want to do it? So let's say the motion is this House would ban patents. Gov here could say that patents curb innovation, since it allows only certain entities to have the sole ability to produce a good. And thus, when everyone can produce the good, there will be more innovation. So by saying that all these ideas are now open access, everyone can work on them, develop them, etc., now you'll have more innovation. The simple question from OP is, why would people do this? Why would they want to do this? Because maybe they can do it, they have the money, they can engage in the research, but it won't make them money. Because if you develop an idea that can be easily stolen by someone else, where someone else could work on already existing ideas rather than trying to create new ideas, why then would someone take on the risk of research, take on the cost of research and development? That would not give them a sufficient incentive to want to do it. So you have to prove that, not just that people can innovate, but that they'd want to engage in this innovation process even without a patent. Third is characterization, meaning you have to explain what something is like a lot of the time. So let's say the motion that this House regrets the rise of retail investment platforms like Robinhood and eToro. Gov here could explain that the people who enter these platforms are often uninformed about financial markets. And there's a question of why? Why are they uninformed about financial markets? And I think one thing you might want to do is characterize the way in which these financial markets these platforms are advertised. So oftentimes they're manipulative and they're deceptive. They tell you it's easy, that anyone can make money, or that you'll win at some point if you just continue to put in money. They'll engage in, say, promos that would convince people to shell out more and more funds until they can earn it all back. And there's the whole gambler's fallacy about it. And so, because of how these platforms work, this is what lures in uninformed individuals into these kinds of platforms. Last is just logical sequencing. You want to put things together in a way that one would imply another. So go back to this House of ban alcohol. Gov argues that one, they prove that the ban will be enforced well. Second is they claim that people can no longer access alcohol. And then they say this will reduce crime. Let's say you are very good at arguing and you argued all of these things successfully. You argued that the enforcement will be done very well. you argued that people can no longer access alcohol. Lastly, you then say that this will reduce crime. There's still something missing here. So even if all the statements you have are true, it's unclear how no alcohol leads to no crime. And so you have to understand, what is this logical sequence of arguments, and does the previous statement imply the next? And you want to make sure that you have no gaps in logic. Otherwise, you would have to supply more reasoning and proof. So you have tools for proof. If that's what you need in order to make an argument true, here are the things you can use to make sure that you can fill in incentives, capacity, etc. You could use intuition, empirical evidence, and structural reasons. And we'll get into what structural reasons are later. But intuition is intuitive. It's just appealing to common knowledge. So let's say the motion is this house would forcibly relocate individuals in disaster-prone areas. You don't really have to prove that disasters are dangerous. You don't have to prove that people could die. You don't have to prove that there are many risks to disasters, for example. Maybe there are specific illustrations, manifestations that might be necessary for your argument, but people generally will believe that disasters are dangerous. That seems quite obvious. And there are a lot of common instances of this. You won't have to prove that corporations want to make a profit. You won't have to prove that politicians want votes. And you won't have to prove that people often want to better their own quality of life. Right? These are all things we all believe. And obviously this doesn't seem like the most compelling proof. But in a 7-minute debate speech, if you proved every little thing, you would be wasting a lot of time, and you will lose time for what might be more controversial claims. And so you save a lot of time here, and you're not what people might call value neutral, meaning you're just proving things that everyone could agree on. Because it's very unlikely in, say, the first example that your opponent will say, no, actually, disasters are not so bad. Maybe they'll try and minimize the harm of a disaster, but there's no way they're going to say that there's no danger involved, right? And so because of that, if you're working on things that everyone can believe and everyone will agree to anyway, it's unlikely that this is going to be a very good use of your time. So intuition can be a very powerful tool in that sense. Second is you could use empirical evidence. So simply it's using past examples or actions. This is where reading up becomes very powerful. So you can say, for example, in the motion, this House believes that the US should lift sanctions on Iran. You could point to the JCPOA or the previous Iran nuclear deal and say that in this time, Iran genuinely denuclearized as a consequence of the JCPOA. And the advantages of using empirical evidence is that they're very realistic, they're very specific. And so if you have a judge that hears this for the first time and they think that, oh, well, there's an actual legitimate example of this, it makes it a bit more believable. You're not just making things up. It's not in this debate world. It's an actual real world thing that happens. But the disadvantages of just using empirical evidence are that it could seem like an argument by example, and that you can have two examples that prove completely opposite claims. So you can have an example where, for example, let's say the motion is this House supports protectionist policies in developing countries. You could have examples where that worked, and you can have examples where that failed. And just using examples could point to completely opposite claims and outcomes. And so you can't rely solely on empirical evidence, but it does help in being able to fully flesh out an argument, especially ones that are based on, say, trends. International relations will heavily rely on empirical evidence, for example. Another disadvantage is it's hard to assess the truth of facts. So the judge in a debate takes on the role of an ordinary intelligent voter. And so if you came up with an outright lie and said the current president of the US is still Donald Trump, it's not likely the judge will believe you, right? But let's say it's some very niche matter, that X country is winning the war in this region, and maybe the judge doesn't know much about that country. Or you bring up a very, very complex economic term or a very complex scientific term that not everyone might be familiar with. Even if it is true, debating should not expect the judge to know this entirely. And so you can't rely solely on empirical evidence as well, because the judge can't be the arbiter of the truth of certain things, especially if your opponent will claim the opposite thing to be true. The judge can't say, well, I heard this in the news, therefore you're right, because that puts a very, very high burden on judges to be arbiters of not just debating and reason, but also facts. So that's some of the disadvantages of empirical reasons. Now we go to structural reasons. And this takes a bit more explaining, but these are reasons that stem from how something is structured, or is organized, or operates. So for example, if I were to prove that police officers have perverse incentives to coerce people to admit the crimes they did not commit, a structural reason for this is that officers are rewarded for closing cases, and police departments are seen as more favorably when they have a high rate of catching criminals. So if you say that we had maybe X cases of crime, and most of these cases we have found the criminal, we close the case, people will think, wow, that's a very efficient, effective police system, and they will think, let's fund the police more. Similarly, on an officer department level, they might say, well, this guy closed these many cases in the last month. Maybe they're due for a promotion. Maybe we should give them a higher role or more responsibility. And as a consequence of that, when you coerce people to admit the crimes they did not commit, it's easier, it's less time consuming, and it's less costly than an extensive investigation where you go through all the evidence. The system rewards these behaviors. And that's a structural reason, because I'm explaining to you, here's the structure of how a police department works, and as a consequence of that, here's how things are likely to occur. I hear a lot of people use structural reasons for just reasons that might not be structural. And this is the importance of why it's a structural reason, which is that it's very hard to deny how something works and operates. It's very easy. It's actually also a lot of evidence, and this mixes in with the empirical evidence, that is how real-world systems work and operate as well. And therefore, this is very helpful in proving both incentives as well as characterizations in trying to explain how some things might end up working. So advantages, these are very easy to believe, and they give reasons for observable evidence. I think rather than just saying, here is the truth, structural reasons will always tell you, here are the reasons why what is true is true. And that kind of appeals to a judge who can only really use logical reasons to be able to discern different facts, different evidence, etc. Structural reasons are a good basis for thinking about what should they believe in a debate. The disadvantages are, one is that it's very hard to weigh between reasons to prove opposite things. So let's say you have 3 structural reasons on both sides for different things. Then you'd have to go through other ways of tackling them. Second is that it's very time consuming, which is why, again, you don't want to have to use structural reasons to prove that a natural disaster is dangerous. For things that are obvious, use intuition. For things that need more grounding, use empirical evidence. And for things that might require more rigorous proofs, structural reasons might be the best way to go about them. That's all for this, and hopefully that helps kind of give insight as to how you want to prove an argument.